The topic of today's talk is social networks and emergence, and there's a kind of a funny translation issue that came up when I was looking at the English translation of the events today and of my speech in particular. The word emergence, which is the title of my second book, which I talked about a little bit last night, is a word that means, in a sense, a system where some higher level behavior or intelligence or pattern comes out of a lot of low level interaction between parts that aren't necessarily aware of the higher level form they're making. So in the city example, a neighborhood is often an emergent phenomenon of cities. No one, sometimes people do, but most of the time people don't deliberately plan neighborhoods. They just spontaneously emerge out of thousands or millions of individual decisions made by the residents of the city to live there or move there or hang out. And over time, a neighborhood with personality and some kind of endurance emerges out of all those local decisions. So I wrote a whole book about that, and in some sense I've been talking about issues around emergence for a very long time. There's a very similar English word, which is emergency, which means something totally different. And an emergency is, when your house is on fire, that's an emergency. You have to call the fire department. When there's a major crisis somewhere, that's an emergency. So I noticed that the English translation of my talk was social networks and emergency. I just wanted to make it clear that I was not planning on talking about emergencies, but in fact, I've decided to talk a little bit about emergencies. I'm going to talk about emergence and emergencies, just to show you how adaptable I am. We'll get to the emergencies right at the very end, but for the most part, we're going to talk about emergence. I wanted to start by going back in time a little bit, something I alluded to last night that I didn't talk about too much so I could save some of this material. Let's talk about an old-style urban social network, which is really central to my last book, The Invention of Air, and that is the 18th century coffee house, the 18th century British coffee house. You can see up here on the image here, this is a scene of some madness and bedlam. I don't think it was quite that chaotic. This was the Starbucks of the 18th century. And in fact, it turns out that the social networks that formed in the coffee houses of the 18th century literally changed the world. They had an immense impact on politics, on science, on religion, on businesses. People would hang out in these coffee shops, they would get together in these groups, they would hang out for 4 or 5 hours, and they were real kind of intellectual hubs where people from different backgrounds who have different kind of fields of expertise would hang out, wildly over-caffeinate themselves, and in that kind of crazed frenzy that you see right there, in part they invented the modern world. So many things that we now kind of take for granted that came out of that period have their roots somewhere in a coffee house. So the entire insurance business was largely, the whole idea of an insurance corporation was invented in Lloyd's Coffee House in London, which became Lloyd's of London, and still kind of perseveres to this day. In my book, there's a kind of momentous exchange between Joseph Priestley and Ben Franklin, who met at this coffee house called the London Coffee House, and Franklin had a group there called the Club of Honest Whigs, and they would get together every 2 weeks and hang out and talk about ideas, and just an amazing number of kind of innovations came out of that space. And I think that part of what we should be doing in thinking about social networks and thinking about emergent behavior and thinking about how these social networks map onto cities is to try and take some of that energy and some of that inventiveness that you see in systems like the 18th century coffee house and try and bring that online or recreate it in our urban spaces. So we want to build environments that may not look quite like that, but that have the same effect, that have the same kind of invigorating intellectual power that the 18th century coffee house had. I'll say one little anecdote here, which is relevant tangentially, which is another important thing about the 18th century coffee house is that they were drinking coffee. Because up until the 18th century, the daytime beverage of choice for both the mass and the elites in England and in most other countries of that period was alcohol. It was the safe choice to drink alcohol because the water wasn't safe to drink. And so because of the antibacterial properties of alcohol, people would wake up in the morning and they would have a little bit of beer, and then they would have a little bit of wine, and then particularly in the 1600s they would have gin in the afternoon, a little bit more wine. And so you had an entire population who was basically drunk all day long. And this was kind of par for the course. And when coffee and tea got introduced in the beginning of the 1700s and very quickly became affordable, they went from being a luxury item to kind of a staple of the diet in about 50 years, you in a sense had an entire culture that shifted from drinking all day to imbibing a stimulant, from basically taking a depressant to drinking a stimulant all day. And it's not surprising then that a great flowering of ideas happened shortly after they got off alcohol and moved to coffee. The Age of Enlightenment is almost certainly related to the switch from alcohol to caffeine as the drug of choice, right? Imagine what your lives would be like if you drank all day and then switched to coffee. You'd have better ideas, right? I know some of you do drink all day, and that's fine. But so the coffee house is bound up both in the physical space and in what they were actually drinking. But what you see in these spaces that's important to kind of translate over when we think about social networks is that social networks are a third place in that classic Oldenburg idea of it's not home and it's not work. It's a kind of border space between the very private and the official kind of work public space. And that is their power. And that's the opportunity, is to expand the kind of the realm of the third place in the virtual world, and maybe to connect it to physical, real-world third places like coffee shops in our cities. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about this in my personal history with social networks, which is I think relevant here. When Twitter first became, started to kind of cross over into the mainstream, I was promoting this last book, The Invention of Air, and I had been on Twitter for a while, and I started to use it a little bit more as an author in kind of a professional capacity, and it turned out that Twitter was a fantastic social network for that kind of thing, because you could get a relatively big audience. You could talk to them about what was going on your book tour. You can tell them about things that were happening if a review came out. You could build up a nice crowd for events if you were coming to a new town and things like that. So I was using it quite a bit. And I think at that point I was probably one of the better known authors who was really invested in Twitter as a platform. And so about a little more than a year ago, Twitter decided to create something called the Suggested User List. And this was the list was a response to a problem that Twitter had and that all social networks have, which is that when you first join them, before you actually make friends or start following people, they are utterly useless, right? A social network, when you're not connected to anyone, is nothing. It's not a useful thing. You just have a blank screen, right? And so Twitter was trying to figure out a way to kind of, for people who are coming to the service for the first time, how do you create a kind of an on-ramp that will allow them to actually do something useful and quickly see the value of the service? And so they created a list of people that they thought would be interesting for you to follow. And I think it was initially a list of about 40 people or something like that. And they've added to it over time. So I think because I was doing interesting things as an author, they put me on this list. And it meant that every single person who signed up for Twitter was shown this list and would have the opportunity to check me and follow me. And that meant that over the next year, I accumulated 1.5 million followers on Twitter. So the size, basically, just a little smaller than the city of Curitiba I have following me on Twitter. And it was a very strange thing, because it went from a group of people who were really interested in my stuff, who were either friends or people who read my books, to just a mass audience of total strangers, most of whom had no idea who I was. And in fact, seemed to have no idea what Twitter was at all. So anytime I would tweet something, I would get a number of replies from people saying, "What are you? What is Twitter?" And then I would sometimes get angry tweets from people saying, "Why are you showing up in my feed?" And I was like, "I'm not, you chose me, you picked me on the list, it's not my fault, don't get mad at me." And so it went from a very, kind of a small and manageable network to something that was the size of, a good-sized city or a large television network or something like that. And it's been a very kind of weird process. And what happens now, they subsequently killed the list for reasons I'll talk about. But so I'm not adding any new subscribers now, other than just people who organically come and follow me. So this means that because it's such a large number, whenever I tweet anything, I instantly lose 100 followers. Just immediately, there's 100 people who say, "I don't want to follow that guy anymore." So it's very depressing now. I'm just on this little, I've hit my high point, and I'm just slowly going down. It makes it hard for me to actually get up the momentum to tweet anything anymore when I know I'm going to lose so many people every time I do it. But the reason they killed it is, the basic sense that people hated the suggested user list. And they hated it for a very good reason, which was it has created a disproportionate number of followers for a small number of people who in a sense hadn't earned that following. Oprah deserves 1.5 million followers. I do not deserve 1.5 million followers. And the reason why it was such a problem is that it distorted the social graph. The social graph is what we call, it's kind of the fancy term for basically the map of the social network. So it's the software's ability to keep track of everyone who is connected to everybody else. And that map of how many people are connected to each other is the key asset of any big social network. It's a key asset of Facebook, it's a key asset of Twitter, it's a key asset of MySpace, to the extent that MySpace is still participating in this. The ability to kind of both have software that recognizes those social connections and accurately represents them, and to expose that network to other people so that they can build on top of that network and do interesting things with it, about which we'll talk a little bit more. That is the essence of what a social network was. And by creating this list, they were creating this bizarre kind of A-list category of people who got all these free followers and had a disproportionate impact in the system. And so they killed it, and I think it was the right thing to do, even though I benefited from it. I think it was an appropriate thing. And I think the controversy about the suggested user list points to an important thing, that people feel very passionate about these networks. They are supposed to map accurately relationships between people, and they feel very protective of them. If you see somebody who's suddenly becoming a superstar through some artificial means, it feels wrong. It feels like, no, this network should map accurately the way that people connect to each other in their real-world relationships. So we saw that passion and how strongly people feel about these things just a few weeks ago when Google rolled out Google Buzz. How many people followed the Google Buzz story? So Google Buzz is Google's attempt to build something quite like Facebook and Twitter. It's this interesting place where Google is actually playing catch-up, which is not a position they're normally used to playing. And in starting their social network, they decided that they would get around the problem of what do you do with the user on day one? How do you get him to populate, or her to populate his or her network? Instead of creating a suggested user list, they said, hey, we've already got a social network built into people's email contacts with Gmail. We know everybody you've emailed for the past 5 years, for the past 2 years, or something like that. And so we can kind of auto-populate your list of people you want to follow by looking at your Gmail contacts and suggesting people and creating this network for you, instantly when you sign up for the service. So they built it into Gmail, and they basically set it up so that your network would be created and would become public pretty much without you doing anything other than saying, yes, I'd like to join Google Buzz. This meant that a whole network of people that you'd been interacting with in Gmail through email were suddenly part of a public social network. And it caused a firestorm of criticism almost immediately. Because people actually had a very clear distinction in their heads between what happened in their email correspondence and what happened in their kind of semi-public life in social networks. Somebody who's, furtively interviewing for jobs and thinking about quitting their job at work and sending a bunch of emails from their Gmail account to a bunch of other potential employers, suddenly those employers show up in their social network. That's a mistake. That's not something you want to happen. You want to have happen. And so Google quickly backtracked, but it really revealed how strongly people feel. They turned the feature off basically and made it much harder to kind of automatically expose your network in that sense. But it shows you that these third places have boundary issues, right? This is what happens when you're in a zone that's half public and half private. These are your friends, but it's also people who maybe you wouldn't necessarily fully consider friends. I certainly don't know all 1.5 million of my followers, although I feel very close to them. So you're half in private and half in public in this way, and when we create applications, when we create services that use these social networks, we have to be very aware of these boundary issues, the privacy issues, the feeling of ownership that people have, and you can get in a lot of trouble quickly by kind of moving roughly over those sensitivities. What I'm really fascinated with here, and this connects directly to what we were talking about last night, and of course directly to the theme of this whole event, is why these platforms, particularly Facebook and Twitter, have been such amazing engines of innovation in such a short amount of time. Twitter as a service, Facebook as a service have been dramatically transformed in terms of the uses people are getting out of them in the short number of years, 2 to 4 years that they've been around. There's been just a remarkable pace of new ideas and new implementations and new tools that have come out for these platforms. And so I want to talk about that for two reasons. The first of which is, I think there's some interesting lessons that we can all learn, and I talked about them a bit last night, from platforms like this. Why did they become such hotbeds of innovation? What was it about that particular platform that encouraged people to develop on it and to come up with all these creative ideas? Are there kind of patterns or metaphors that we can port over into the things that we're doing that may not be online, that we can learn from the way that Twitter and Facebook have worked? And then secondly, by understanding how this past innovation has worked out, we can start thinking about new things that we can build on these platforms too. Because I promise you they are going to be central to the communication inside a large organization like a city. Cities are going to rely on things like Twitter and Facebook more and more, or their descendants, whatever comes after. And so there's a lot of opportunity to build interesting things on top of these platforms. So I'm interested really in this question of emergent innovation. You create a network, and then all of a sudden, by creating that network, all these interesting, unanticipated things get built on top of it. Things the creators never intended. If you build your system right, it will start doing things that will invariably surprise you. Sometimes they'll horrify you. Most of the time, they'll be really exciting and rewarding because you'll see the system being steered towards new uses that are completely surprising and energizing to you. So how do we do that? So one of the first things, the first principles here, one of the key reasons, particularly Twitter and Facebook, were so successful at encouraging this emergent innovation, is that they were open platforms. So that anybody could come along and develop on top of these systems, the application space on Facebook and then the entire Twitter platform. So one way to think about this is to think about APIs. How many people know what an API is? Okay, not so many. So let me just do a very quick technical description of this because it's important, and it's an important metaphor for cities as well. An API is an application programming interface. And it's basically when you have a certain kind of application or an operating system like Windows or the Mac, there are a set of kind of conventions for talking to that system if you're going to build another piece of software. So there's a kind of a common language that is agreed upon by the creator of the original software that says, if you build a piece of software that talks to my software, we can communicate using these key kind of agreed upon terms. And APIs are very important in software, so anytime anybody builds something for Windows, they have to think about various APIs that are part of the Windows environment, and they have to think about that when they develop something for the iPhone and various other platforms out there. In general, what happens is people build a software platform, and then they think about building an API, which in a sense is a little side door in the platform that lets other people come in and access some of the data there. Okay? Google Maps, for instance, has an API. That's why we have so many maps out there on the web. It's because Google created the whole mapping platform, and then they created an API so that other people could come along and enter data very easily, and you could create a little interesting mashup of your city. We saw some of them last night. I'm sure other people have shown them over the course of the conference. That's a classic API thing. You build a cool software platform, and then you build a little API that people can talk to outside developers who aren't necessarily on your payroll. What Twitter did is something quite profound. They built the API first. They started by thinking about their service as a platform that other people were going to build on from the very beginning. And then they built Twitter.com on top of it. So the service that you guys use, they thought of it as just kind of, they were the #1 developers for an API, and then other people were going to access that API in the exact same way that they were. That sounds a little technical, but it's a very important kind of philosophical idea here, is that you're building platforms that are entirely open. They're thought of as open from the very, very beginning. One argument that I think is important to start thinking about is that every city is going to have an API down the line. And the API is going to have data for crime reports, it's going to have data about real estate values, it's going to have data about government spending, it's going to have data about potholes in the street. And there's going to be a standardized way of describing that information, and any developer, any programmer who wants to come in and talk to that API to build a new application to work on that data in a novel way will be able to do that because there's a standardized API. So thinking about an API as part of the city strategy is very important. You know, it's going to be a kind of commonplace thing in the next couple of years. So Twitter thought of itself from the API first, and then it built Twitter on top of that. And that meant that from the very beginning, there were lots of different clients, lots of different Twitter kind of software packages on people's phones, on their BlackBerries, on their iPhones, on the web, where people could use Twitter as a service without ever going to twitter.com. There's a huge number of people who just never go, who are active participants in the social network of Twitter, but they actually never, you know, other than the day they signed up, they've never actually visited twitter.com because they use, you know, I use a program on my iPhone called Tweety. Twitter didn't make Tweety. Some other developer made Tweety, and it's actually better than, you know, using the regular Twitter web app on my phone. So Twitter is losing audience on some level. The person who goes to the Tweety, you know, launches the Tweety app and buys the Tweety app, none of that money is going to the twitter.com people, right? They're losing that revenue. But their idea is that if you create an open platform and you get lots and lots of people involved in that ecosystem, coming in wherever they want, whether it's Tweety or some other application, and adding their data to the underlying social network, to the underlying social graph, in the long run, Twitter will be more valuable as a company. So it's worth it to lose that kind of short-term revenue to build a big platform and to build a big social graph. And so they created this open platform that anybody could develop for. And what that meant is that Twitter, in a sense, had this whole army of people outside the organization who were innovating with the service. They basically said to the entire world of developers who were interested in the Twitter platform, you can be our research and development team. You can create new things based on our platform. We don't have to pay you a cent. And so what's happened has been this amazing flowering of innovation around the Twitter platform. And I'll show you a couple of ones. Some of these you've probably seen. This is something called Twitter Map, one of a number of Twitter platforms. Increasingly now, tweets can come with basic geographic data like latitude and longitude. If you're carrying it around and tweeting from your phone, if you approve this, your geographic coordinates can be embedded in the little message you send out in those, you know, in addition to those 140 characters. And so what Twitter Map does is it sits there in real time and looks for tweets that are in any particular geographic region. So this is what I did this morning. I went there and zoomed in on Curitiba, and these were, you know, the most recent 5 tweets from people kind of in downtown Curitiba. It would be fun to do it right now because I'm sure there would be a bunch of tweets here. Most of you saying mean things about me, I'm sure. And so this is developed, you know, completely outside of Twitter, and there are, you know, countless map applications that are out there. And to this date, Twitter, I think actually they just released a trending topics map just the other day, I think. But I think that may have been the first actual map application that Twitter had released kind of 2 years, 3 years into the company's growth. They hadn't bothered to create a mapping application because so many other people were doing it for them. And they were able to just kind of rely on all that kind of innovation and development because they created a platform and an ecosystem that enabled that. Now, another really interesting example of an urban-based social network that uses Twitter as well as a bunch of other things is a service called Foursquare, which celebrated its first birthday, I believe, yesterday or today, maybe even. How many people have heard of Foursquare? Okay, Foursquare is coming your way. It's a very, very interesting service. So what Foursquare is Foursquare is kind of a combination of a social network and a real-world video game, in a sense. And what you do with Foursquare is whenever you go to a place, in this case, a coffee house. This is a coffee house called Think Coffee in New York, I believe. When you go there, you can check in on Foursquare. And check in basically means you pull out your iPhone and you say, hey, I'm in Think Coffee, and you check in. And the system records that you're there. It will, if you want to, it will send out a little alert to your friends telling them that you're there, so if they want to come and hang out and join you at Think Coffee, or at that bar last night that you all wanted me to come join you at. You can do that very easily. So it records that, it sends out that message. You can leave little hints about each place. You can say, hey, you know, the flat white coffee here is really fantastic, and so anybody who visits that place in the future will see those hints. You can automatically use it to send out a message to Twitter as well, saying, hey, I just checked in to Think Coffee. Every time you check into a place, you basically accumulate points for that place. And as you spend more time in a given place, there's a leaderboard that shows the top-ranking people who spent the most time in any given establishment. So, you know, you'll see there are 3 people who spent more time in Think Coffee than you, and you know if you show up there 5 more times, you might get to the top of that leaderboard. And the person who is at the top of the leaderboard is officially called the mayor of that place, the mayor of Think Coffee. And you get little badges as you go through it. So it's all the reward system of a video game, where you're trying to earn points and unlock levels and all this kind of stuff. But it's done entirely by going out and hanging out in your city and letting your friends know where you are. And it turns out that those badges are weirdly addictive. You know, even though technically you're not getting anything for being mayor of Think Coffee, people just want to be mayor of Think Coffee. And so the proprietors of all these establishments love it. Because this is like a frequent flyer program, basically, for the establishment. They've got people who are going in, doing check-ins again and again at these establishments so that they can rise in the leaderboard and become the mayor. And so now Foursquare has started talking to the owners of these places and saying, listen, you should be able to do special offers for your top customers. We're tracking who your top customers are, and we know who their friends are. We can now send out messages through that if you'd like to promote something. And so you'll be walking around the city and you'll get a message like this. It says mayor offer nearby. Nearby at Bowery Wine Company, if you're the mayor, show the bartender and your first drink is free. Beer or house wine, please. No fancy drinks at Bowery Wine Company, right? And so what you have is this whole system that benefits people who are just hanging out and want to meet up with their friends. And it benefits the businesses and the organizations in the community who are going to have a more kind of in-touch relationship with the people who are frequenting their establishment. So it's a very interesting model. And again, you know, it's integrated heavily into Twitter, and it's possible to do that because Twitter was based on an open platform. Then you have just the basic function of search. Search may turn out to be the single most important thing to Twitter's ultimate revenue story when it actually starts focusing on making money as a business. Search may be the thing that ends up making it a profitable company in the long run, because being able to do real-time search advertising is a great business. It's a business, it's, you know, 90% of Google's profits come from real-time search advertising, or from search advertising. Be able to do it in real time with Twitter is going to be an enormously important thing for them. So this is the search I have in my book, Ghost Map. And I've got, standing Twitter queries for lots of different things, and I get to, as an author, listen in on this conversation that people are having about my books. And what's lovely about that is that you get to hear things in social networks that you don't get from traditional reviews, right? When a newspaper writes a review of your book, it's exciting, sometimes it's depressing, sometimes it's scary, but it's very formal, and book reviewers are different from normal readers. When you get to kind of listen in on what people are saying on a social network, you get, kind of interesting real-time feedback. They're in the middle of the book, they're kind of bored, they're excited, and then one guy here is saying he's not liking the opening. So you get this kind of interesting live commentary on what's going on. Now, people use Twitter with this kind of live search. We're using it right now, obviously. We're searching for that hashtag, and somewhere over there, I think there's a live feed, or we've been switching back and forth between a live feed of comments about this very topic. And all of that is dependent on Twitter's ability to search the live feed of tweets. Did Twitter actually create that search engine for itself? No. Twitter's search engine was created by a company called Sociais, which it had no relationship to, which was a little startup that was working on some project that wasn't really working out. Twitter came along, started to take off. They had some search people on their team, and they decided, wow, we could probably build a search engine for Twitter. That would be really useful. And so they built a little cool little tool that they called Sociais. It was like searchsociais.com or something like that. And it became kind of the default resource for searching Twitter. And so eventually the company Twitter made them an offer, acquired all the engineers, and integrated search into Twitter itself. And so there you have, that is the power of an open platform. Here you have a feature that may be the single most important feature in their long-term profitability, and it was developed by somebody who wasn't even on their payroll, somebody they didn't even know. Now eventually they brought them in because it was so important. But that's the beauty of creating a system where anybody can innovate on top of it. You never know what you're going to find. You're going to find all these interesting things, some of which are going to be boring, some of which are going to be useless, but you're going to find gems in there. And if you can get those gems and promote them, you're going to have a platform that does so much more with far less than you'd ever imagine. The other thing that has made Twitter and Facebook so interesting and so innovative is what's happened with the non-programmers. There is a tremendous amount of stuff that's happened just in the way that people are using the service, right? So you think about, Twitter, both Twitter and Facebook kind of started with this idea of, kind of simple updates that you can share with your friends. Facebook was partially about sharing photos and mapping your social network. Twitter was really focused on these little 140-character status updates. And the joke about Twitter in the early days was, I don't need to know what my friends are having for breakfast, right? People would be like, why do I care about that? That's not all that interesting. I don't really know why I need to know what cereal you're having this morning, right? Because that was the way it was kind of originally designed. You were going to send out these quick little messages about what you were doing. But it turns out that the service has all these uses that the creators didn't intend, that were created not by programmers or software startups, as in the Sociais example, but created by just ordinary people figuring out new things to do with it without having any programming skills at all. And that's something we call end-user innovation. It's an important kind of principle in how innovation happens. People will create interesting things, and then they hand them to their consumers, and the consumers figure out uses that the creators never dreamed of. So in the case of some of the social networks, just the idea of using a hashtag was something that was not built into the Twitter service. This is a version of the live feed we have over here. This was this morning with the hashtag for, I guess I was doing the hashtag of CIRS. We've been looking at the hashtag, I think, for 2010 with CC. But this idea of kind of simultaneously doing this and agreeing on a convention so that every tweet associated with this conference should use that hashtag. That's a convention that was not part of the original kind of Twitter software. It was not something that the creators pointed to. It was something that users just started doing. And it's created this very interesting thing, whereas right now anybody who's following this on Twitter right now is having this kind of silent back channel conversation. where you're able to kind of comment on and expand on and suggest links and make fun of everything that's going on here on stage, right? And that was not at all something that the Twitter guys thought of when they first started the service. Now that can have disastrous effects. There's a wonderful conference that's going on right now, South by Southwest, in Austin, Texas. And 2 years ago, I think it was, right as Twitter was starting to kind of break out, there was an interview between a reporter and Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. And basically, it turned out to be one of the most catastrophic conference interviews in the history of technology conferences. What happened was basically the reporter was interviewing Zuckerberg and was doing it in a kind of annoying way. She wasn't really asking good questions. The audience was very techy, and so they wanted a lot of tech questions. She seemed to be kind of flirting with him in a way that seemed a little bit odd to people in the room. And basically, a lot of the audience was kind of annoyed by the way the interview was going. Now, in the past, that annoyance would have happened basically would have passed in silence. Every individual person kind of thinking to themselves, gosh, this interview was annoying. Or maybe they would mutter to their friend next to them, boy, this interview was annoying. But it happened that this whole audience was silently communicating on this back channel using a hashtag. And as the interview progressed, a consensus emerged in the audience that this was the worst interview ever in the history of conference interviews. And the audience got more and more enraged and started saying more and more kind of nasty things as the interview progressed. And I'm really hoping this is not going on right now about this speech. And so by the time they went to Q&A, and they said, hey, anybody have any questions? Somebody got up and asked kind of an angry question, and the reporter kind of turned and she said, oh wait, do you guys not like my interviewing style? And the whole room erupted in applause, in angry applause, saying, yes, you're doing a terrible job. And it was awful, it was really embarrassing to watch. And the point, of course, is that she had the least amount of information there in the whole room. Everybody else knew that the crowd was turning against her, but she couldn't see that because it was this kind of silent conversation happening. So it was a fascinating moment in kind of group dynamics and in kind of the whole idea of having a live conversation running with a live event and what that kind of space creates in the way that we talk to each other when we talk in an event like this. All these new things were happening. And it was so far from, I'm having Cheerios for breakfast, right? And this was just a year after Twitter launched. And it didn't take any new software, it didn't take any new developers, it was just this agreement that we should use this convention. I suppose it took the search tool, but besides that, it was basically just that the users coming up with this new pattern. The other thing that people are doing on Facebook and on Twitter a lot is sharing links. Instead of saying, this is what I'm having for breakfast, they're saying, this is what I read today. I'm reading this interesting article. I would say I now read 50% of my diet of things that I read every morning come to me through social networks on Twitter or Facebook. So I have switched from saying to the editorial team at the New York Times, tell me what's important today by choosing these stories on the front door. I have implicitly said, no, you know what, I'm interested in that and I will continue to look at that, but I'm more interested in what the people I'm following, what they're reading today. That's going to be a more interesting, more relevant, if you follow the right people, more eclectic, if you have a kind of a diverse range of opinions that you follow, which is important to do. And so people are passing around these links. This is one view you can do in Twitter, which is kind of recently retweeted things among your social network. And it's a really great source of what people are talking about every morning. Increasingly, that's going to be central to the search functionality as well. So it's not just using the service to talk about what you had for breakfast, it's using the service to talk about what story is the most important thing right now in your extended social network. And there are all these local things. This is an amazing thing that's starting to happen in New York. I don't know if it's come to Brazil yet. There are all these kind of gourmet food trucks that are starting to populate the streets of New York. We used to have ice cream trucks where the kids would, they would hang out outside of the park and you'd hear that annoying little song that they would play and, the kids would get ice cream. And that worked because you knew there were always going to be children at the playground or at the park, and so you could put your truck right there. And so that made sense as a business. But if you had kind of a more gourmet truck that was selling to nicer food to a non-child audience, and you wanted to roam around the city, it was a little bit hard because it was very hard to get people to come to your truck or know where you were that day and things like that. But Twitter and Facebook have changed all that, and now you have something like this is the waffle truck that travels around New York and Manhattan and Brooklyn, and they of course have their own Twitter account, and they're announcing where they're going every day, and they've got 5,000 followers, 5,000 people following a truck. That is what it's come to, right? And so they're able to kind of get word out, and people are excited when they come to their neighborhood and they get out there and they can do special offers and things like that. And so there's this kind of weird little local micro community that's forming around this truck. And again, this is not something that they thought of when they were starting Twitter. The other thing I found is that Twitter is a great resource for just asking people questions. I mean, I'm often kind of sitting somewhere and thinking, gosh, I wonder what the best route for this is, or I wonder what people think about this, or I wonder what the best, I want to buy a new MacBook and I'm thinking about this, what should I do? And then I think, oh wow, I've got 1.5 million people right here in my pocket who, some of them are going to have great answers to this question. And so, like just the other day I talked about Max Fiber in last night's speech, and I had written about him extensively, but I wasn't trying to pronounce his name. And so I said, hey Twitter, how do you pronounce Max Fiber's name? And I got 30 responses within 5 minutes. Now that's partially because I have a lot of followers, but that's going to become increasingly common. And I just did a couple of searches. Sometimes people say hive mind when they ask these questions, which is kind of a term from, I think Kevin Kelly popularized it. It's a term I use a little bit in Emergence, which is basically the collective mind of people on Twitter. So these are just some of the queries that I found. Hey, hive mind, big question for you. Name me a great big classic work of literature with a lady heroine. And then somebody will be like, dear hive mind, if a person didn't have a TV, which Olympic moments are must-sees? Hive mind, hip and cheap outdoor dining chairs. Everything, people are asking all these different questions. And this one, greetings hive mind. Has anyone flown Virgin America from JFK to LAX? Is it nice? Now you know why you signed up to follow me. This tweet is from John Hodgman, who is the actor and comedian who plays PC in the Mac versus PC ads in the United States. And is also a regular on The Daily Show, a very funny guy. And he also started this use for Twitter, which I've never seen anybody else do since, which is he live tweets from his Scrabble games with his wife, Scrabble with the letters. So he'll get a hand on Scrabble and he'll say, I have 4 I's plus a U and an O and a blank. P.S. if I'm playing Scrabble with you, do not read this. And people will tweet back suggestions of what you can spell with that and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's really going to take off. But so you can see there's just amazing diversity in uses for this stuff coming in all these directions. And I think as we get more and more geographically aware, and it's become more and more common to include geographic data in your tweets, people who are thinking about real-world communities, physical spaces, particularly dense populated city centers, are going to have just an amazing set of opportunities for using this technology and pushing it in new directions. So I promised you that I would say a little bit about emergencies and do both emergence and emergencies. So I wanted to say first that we have already seen that when extraordinary and often horrible breaking news happens, the social networks are extremely fast at getting the word out. When earthquakes happen, the news gets out through Twitter and Facebook at really an exceptional speed. It really is faster than cable news, and you can see a lot of that information is being disseminated. Sometimes it's inaccurate, sometimes it's it's noisier than traditional news, but we've seen that word gets out very quickly through these services. But I think the most interesting recent development in terms of the power of networks and this thing is the texting donations that came out after the Haiti earthquake. How many people use text messaging to donate money to Haiti relief efforts? Did anybody do that? Okay, you all are very bad people. No. No. What happened was basically the Red Cross and a number of other services discovered that you could basically contribute charitable donations to relief efforts in Haiti and other places by texting a message to a number, and then would automatically deduct $10 from your phone bill. So there wasn't any credit card implementation. You didn't have to, or you didn't have to give some, show up somewhere and write somebody a check. You didn't have to go through the mail. You could just literally pick up your cell phone and text message Haiti to this number, and $10 would immediately go to that cost, right? The word got out about this in large part through Twitter and Facebook, and people were passing around these links right after the earthquake happened, saying, "Hey, text message this, and you can donate $10." And it was, the top topic on Twitter for days and days and days. And it turned out, over the first couple of weeks after that, exclusively through that text messaging system, the Red Cross raised $30 million. So you could see this kind of instantaneous, phone-based, social network-enabled micro donations can raise very large sums of money in a very short amount of time with almost no kind of institutional support. You don't need to kind of build a whole call center. You don't need to do anything. You basically need to set up the kind of connection to that particular text message number and then let it go viral on the networks. If you've got a good cause, it can bring in a lot of money, even in these small little micro donations. That was a very telling response. And what it makes me wonder is, can we use these kinds of systems to build support, maybe to build financial support for smaller events and for smaller causes and more local causes? I think that is going to be one of the places where we're really ripe for breakthrough work to happen. And I bet there are people in this room who could be uniquely talented at making something like this happen, right? So it's not, there's a giant earthquake, we need to raise $30 million. It's, hey, we're trying to find funding for this new playground, we're having this event right now, or this one thing just happened in our community and we need $1,000 for it. We now have the ability to send out messages to people based on geography. So you can send out messages to people within a certain geographic range. You can limit it to social networks of people who are inside a certain geographic range. We've got that easy payment mechanism. Maybe there's something there that we can do for the small emergencies, the small needs of local life. It's not just about the global catastrophes, but the things happening around the corner. And in a way, the best model for this is a new service called Kickstarter. And Kickstarter is one of my favorite things. It just kind of makes a smile come on my face every time I think about it. What Kickstarter is they sometimes call it micro-patronage. And the idea is that anybody who has a project they're working on, and a lot of these projects are creative, they can go to Kickstarter and say, I need $10,000 to finish recording my album. Or I need $3,000 for supplies so that I can do this giant painting that I want to do. Or I'm starting a club that's going to help kids in this neighborhood. I need $500 for equipment to start it up. You put a little notice of it on Kickstarter. And what Kickstarter does is that it helps with the financing process. They promote it, but they create a system where people can pledge money to your project, and their credit cards won't be charged until you've raised your target amount. So if you say, I need $5,000 to do this, people can pledge $5, they can pledge $10, they can pledge $30, but they won't actually pay that money until you've reached your goal of $5,000. So nobody's going to pay $50 for something that actually doesn't get built. And the system is also set up so that you can get stuff back, right? So it is charitable kind of donation. It is being a patron of the arts on some level, but you get special rewards for being a patron. So, and the site spells these things out very clearly. So you can say, listen, if you support my album, if you give more than $100, I will come and play a concert at any venue of your choice. It can be your living room or wherever. If you put in more than $20, I will give you a signed copy of the CD when it comes out. You create the incentives, whatever they are. I saw one place where they said, if you contribute more than $100, one of our team will be your personal slave for one day. Really, I'm not kidding. And so people come up with these kind of crazy things. And this is exactly the kind of thing where, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we would have said, we're going to use computers to connect people who are asking for money and really just asking for donations to small little projects, just finish an album or do a painting, and they're not really giving anything back in return other than, you know, maybe a special little reward or the equivalent of a little tote bag. And people would say, well, that's not a business. You know, maybe that would work a little bit, but that's never going to get to real scale. And it turns out Kickstarter, which is only a year old, seems to be doing extremely well. They've actually attracted venture capital investment from Union Square Ventures, which is the top venture capitalist in all of New York, and really all of the East Coast. So here you have this kind of, you know, charitable donation, micro patronage for the arts that's getting venture capitalists interested in investing in it. Something there is interesting. And in fact, the model that I put up here, actually, this is one project which is a kind of a hacker club for kids in Detroit, which is itself, as I mentioned last night, kind of an interesting city for innovation right now. And they set up this request where they're asking for $5,000 to support this program that they're doing for kids. It will help them kind of make things and do interesting robotics and things like that. And they set up this goal for $5,000. Thus far, they've got 32 backers. They've got over $1,000 pledged, and they've got 23 days to go. And we've seen with, you know, political campaigns, when you create a countdown, a clock, and you can see the impact of your contributions, that this is a great tool for raising money. So I think that this is kind of the model when we think about kind of the micro emergencies and social networks and the kind of financial and community support and time support that are required for real civic engagement. That this is a fantastic model for cities, particularly on the neighborhood level, on the local level. Where you're saying, listen, we've got a group together. We think we can make our environment a better place. We're interested in opening up this little service here, or starting this project here, or, you know, trying to clean up this area here. We want to get people involved. We want to get the word out. We're going to use kind of a social network to get the word out. We're also going to raise money for it and get support and get patrons for it through something like Kickstarter or something like the Haiti text messaging service. All those things are ingredients for local innovation that literally didn't exist 5 years ago. And so I think if we can take these models and start applying them to, you know, changing the neighborhoods and the communities around us, the way we're applying them to both, you know, making the coffee places more profitable and helping, you know, artists and musicians on Kickstarter, I think there's a tremendous opportunity. So finally, you know, I'm excited to answer questions, but I just wanted to ask for your personal support. Since I'm losing 100 followers every tweet, please follow me, help me out. I'm down to 1.48 million. I need your help. So contribute now, and thank you for listening. Appreciate it.